Hi, and welcome to this webinar on the intricacies of regulation for software supply chain security as it's being compared between the US and the EU. I'm very, very fortunate to have a real expert on the subject with me tonight, or this morning, depending on where you are in the world. I have with me Courtney Lang, the Vice President of Policy, Trust, Data, and Technology at ITI. And if you don't know what ITI is, it's the Information Technology Industry Council. Another thing that Courtney is famous for, or at least she should be, is that she is responsible for ITI's global cybersecurity policy portfolio, which means she is uniquely suited to discuss comparisons in regulation between different parts of the world, in this case, the US versus the EU. So Courtney, thank you so much for agreeing to joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here. And yes, ITI is a trade association. We represent 80 member companies that are very interested in cybersecurity across the value chain. So all of our member companies very much prioritize cybersecurity. And so policies that are unfolding internationally are something that we are very interested in engaging in, following, and providing input into.
Great. So any discussion when it comes to software supply chain security, which is obviously part of the cybersecurity regulation and attacks which have been unfolding recently, should start with definitions, because different people, different countries define them differently. So how do you, just to make sure we're on equal footing, how do you define software supply chain security and software supply chain attack?
Yeah, so generally we understand software supply chain security to be a set of practices that an organization undertakes in order to secure the components, the activities, the practices that are involved in the development and deployment of software. So that could be evaluating and addressing risks that might be present when it comes to the code or the people or the processes that are contributing really to the development and the delivery of the software. A supply chain attack in the software space occurs when a threat actor is able to infiltrate or compromise software in some way, whether that's through a cyber attack, close access, any other type of kind of compromise in the supply chain. So that's kind of how we understand the two terms.
Well, it definitely feels comprehensive enough, and we can, I mean, not just you and me, but probably all the people who have tuned in to listen can definitely see how this could be an issue for both for companies and for governments, and why people would like to make sure that software being produced is as secure as possible. So let's start, by diving in. What are the latest binding regulations, stuff that people definitely should know and follow regarding software supply chain security in the US?
Yeah, so in the US, there is certainly a lot that has been going on over the last several years. And I think, a couple of interesting policy proposals to note, though I think we're at a unique time in that we're waiting on aspects of, certain regulatory proposals in the US to actually be finalized. So we're having this conversation at a time when there are things that are still in flux. And so a lot of what I'm saying is, things that we think are going to happen in the near future, but have not yet come into force. But to start, Executive Order 14028, which was published in 2021 in May, laid out, a series of different directions to agencies across the US federal government. And there was an explicit section 4, that is focused on enhancing software supply chain security. That specific part of the executive order directed the National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the US to promulgate software supply chain security guidelines. And it included a list of practices that the administration thought NIST should try to include in those guidelines. Those include things like providing a software bill of materials for each product, either to the person that you are selling the software to, or by publishing it on a website. And so that was included kind of in the language of the executive order itself. So NIST was tasked with developing these guidelines, which it has since put out. At the same time, executive
the SSDF,
order.
just want to make sure that everybody, just a second. that everybody are aware of the shortened name, because we'll probably be referring to it later, which is the SSDF. NIST SSDF version 1.1, iteration of these guidelines. And they have definitely been, I think, relatively successful in encompassing a very, very good offering of practices for enhancing software supply chain security. But that wasn't it. And it's important to note also that all these requirements, other than being best practices, as they should be, they have not yet been codified into some sort of law. They have not passed through the Senate. There's no actual bill requiring this from everybody. But there is the well-known, or well-known to people who are in the know, threat that if you do not follow these requirements, you cannot do business with the federal government. And the federal government does a lot of business.
Yes, that's right. So one part of the executive order directed the Office of Management and Budget here in the United States to effectively require federal agencies to comply with the guidelines. And so we saw OMB issue first a memo 2218 that requires agencies to adhere to the guidelines. And so it says that essentially federal agencies can only use software that is provided by software producers who can attest to the fact that they have utilized SSDF or other secure software development practices as described in the NIST guidance. So it lists kind of a set of steps that these software producers must take in order to sell to the federal government, including completing what we're calling, the self-attestation form here in the US. So in order to sell to the federal government, a software producer will have to complete a self-attestation form to certify that they are in compliance with these guidelines. We are still in the process of developing the self-attestation form in the US. So CISA was tasked as a part of this memo to develop this guidance, or the form. And as a part of that, they're still going through the process of actually finalizing the form. So it is not yet publicly available for consumption. And because of that, that means that agencies are not yet kind of collecting those forms from organizations.
But if I remember correctly, and I checked, the OMB published memo 2316, which was earlier this year, giving more exact timelines. And even though the self-attestation form is not yet officially finalized, it is after final draft. There's no more options to offer updates. So it is probably pretty close to the final version it's going to take. And once finalized, which is probably going to be within this quarter, most probably going to be within this quarter, once finalized, most companies have a very, very limited time window to sign that form and, pray and hope that they have all the evidence required, or, know that they have all the evidence required, although it's a pretty comprehensive form from what I saw.
Yes, that's right. So right now, CISA is in the process of adjudicating comments received on the initial form. Once that happens, it needs to go to OIRA here in the US to review the form, and then they also need to publish it again in the Federal Register for a public review period. So that will take 30 days. Then after that OIRA review and 30-day period, OMB can make any final adjustments, and then they will publish a final draft. And then from that time, there are 3 months for agencies to start collecting the forms for critical software. So critical software is defined by NIST as a part of the executive order, and then 6 months from that time to start collecting for all other software that's being sold to the US government.
Yeah. One other thing that I would like to make clear, because we mentioned that software supply chain is a very intricate web of connections, both within software components and software producers, their subcontractors, their partners, and so on. It is considered common knowledge that if you are selling to the federal government, yes, you need to comply. But if one of your subcontractors sells to you and they don't comply, then that means that your final product might not comply, and you should probably collect from all your subcontractors. and they need to collect from their subcontractors. So that trickle-down effect, as I like to call it, might mean that a much greater number of companies and entities might be required to comply with these requirements, and not just the very top layer of companies that actually sell to the US government. Because most of the really, really big companies don't do a lot more than just aggregate components, put them together, and then sell the completed product to the government or the federal agency.
Right. And I think an interesting part of M2218 and then the follow-on memo, M2316, is that it does say that agencies can request artifacts to demonstrate conformance. So this could include things like a software bill of materials, but it's not a statutory requirement. And then in M2316, it clarifies that software bill of materials are not a statutory requirement and are not required in the self-attestation form. So agencies could theoretically request it, but it is up to the discretion of the agency to determine whether or not they will request that in addition to the self-attestation form. So I think that's a point that has raised some confusion over the last several months. So I just wanted to highlight that as we're chatting.
Yeah, sure. Another point that I can make is that recently executives from SolarWinds have been personally prosecuted following the famous attack back in early 21 or end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. And the same sort of prosecution is probably the predicted outcome if you sign the self-attestation form and something bad happens and you need to show the evidence. How could you sign this? Can you show us that you have some way of backing it up? Where's the evidence? Now, even though the SBOM, for example, is not a statutory requirement, the self-attestation form doesn't actually say we want these specific documents. It just say you need to prove that this happened and this happened, that you did everything you should in these requirements. It's up to both the federal government and the individual companies to prove it by making sure they have all the required attestations and evidence, and making sure that you know exactly what you need to get is part of the issue here. Now, I think we talked enough about the US. It's pretty clear. Let's move across the pond. And what's the situation like in the EU?
Yeah, so the EU has been doing a lot on cybersecurity over the last several years. There's been a series of proposals, but I think the one that is of most relevance to this audience is the Cyber Resilience Act. Like with the US, the Cyber Resilience Act is still in the negotiation phase, and so it is not yet in effect. Right now, the Parliament, the Commission, and the European Council are negotiating a final text. So kind of remains to be seen what will ultimately be in there, but there will be some form of requirement to secure software, handle vulnerabilities appropriately, and there are obligations that are introduced for manufacturers or providers of products with digital elements. So really the scope of the Cyber Resilience Act is fairly broad. They define, for example, product with digital element as any software or hardware product and its remote data processing solutions, including software or hardware components that are placed on the European market separately. So it's a pretty large scope. And there are kind of different obligations. So products have to meet essential baseline cybersecurity requirements across the board. But then there are kind of additional sets of requirements, including conformity assessment for products that the Commission has classified as either critical or highly critical products. And so there are more stringent kind of regulatory requirements if you are developing a product that is considered to be critical or highly critical. And you can see that list of products in the annex of the proposal at this point. Like I said, it's still being negotiated. So most of my comments right now are based on the European Commission's proposed text, but there is also text that the Council has agreed to that is slightly different from the text that the Parliament has agreed to. But of course, overall, many of the provisions will remain similar. There is now language kind of conversations going on, but certainly to the extent that the intent is to kind of uplift cybersecurity across the board, companies will have to meet these kind of baseline cybersecurity requirements.
Is there any mention in the either in the EU or the US regulations of the size of the company or the type of resources needed to invest in it? Because one would assume that a lot of these requirements are going to be requiring intensive investment, both in money and time, resources like people. You might need to train more people. You might need to change some of your processes to comply. One would imagine that bigger companies, bigger producers would have an easier time, but newer companies, startups, people who are just getting started, a company that is essentially 3 people in their imam's basement might have a harder time following such regulation. Is there any kind of mention in either case, the US or the EU, of size being a factor in how you are required to comply?
Not that I am aware of. I would have to double check that. But as I am aware, I don't think that there is a size restriction. So I think it applies across the board, no matter kind of what size company you are.
Okay, good to know. I'm sure that people who are listening and have a small company are like, it's probably not for me, are now pricking their ears up, because yes, it is for everybody. We did mention that one of the major inhibitors in the US, or let's call it sticks, is that if you do not comply, you cannot do business with the federal government. Because the scope, like you said, in the EU is broader, what kind of sticks, what kind of negative impact is there going to be for companies who do not follow?
Yeah, so I mean, right now there is enforcement provisions in the Cyber Resilience Act, and the non-compliance with either the essential cybersecurity requirements or the obligations that are contained within the Cyber Resilience Act essentially states that a company will be subject to fines of up to 15 million euros, or up to 2.5% of its total worldwide annual revenue for the preceding financial year, whichever one is higher. So there are some pretty stringent, I think, enforcement mechanisms contained within the EU Cyber Resilience Act for non-compliance.
Okay. Any other, let's call it, impacts or potential impacts? Is the EU, for example, government or council saying that if you do not comply, you will be prohibited from selling in the EU? You will not be able to move software across borders, anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of. Right now, the enforcement is really focused on kind of the fine component, but certainly that has been a motivating factor in many instances to maintain compliance with the law.
Now, the next question is probably a very, very easy comparison to make. When it comes to EU regulation, one of the most famous ones is the GDPR, which is focused on privacy. Now, the GDPR has been in the headlines recently multiple times, particularly when it comes to the company Meta, which has been sued in the EU for violating privacy, which is different from the US, and the way they're practiced in the US should be different than the way they practice in the EU. GDPR has become practically global in its implication or application. One of the questions that I'm really interested in, and I'm asking you as an expert, is there a chance or a probability for the Cyber Resilience Act to become just as universally applied? Basically, I'm asking if the requirements are easy and straightforward and comprehensive enough to become a global standard.
So sorry, I think there were some connectivity issues that were occurring, so I didn't catch most of what you just said.
Not a problem. I'll repeat it. I said that the GDPR, that's fine. The GDPR is globally recognized as one of the best privacy protection acts. Started in the EU, it's now globally accepted and enforced. I'm asking if there's a probability or a chance that the Cyber Resilience Act would follow suit, which means, is it built in the same way that it's clear, straightforward, easy to understand and apply, which means that if it is, it's likely to become a global standard.
So I think certainly folks around the world are investigating ways in which to uplift their cybersecurity as a baseline. I think that GDPR was introduced at a time when there was perhaps a less comprehensive way in which to address privacy concerns. And so there was interest in jurisdictions around the world in adopting a GDPR-like legal regime to govern privacy. In the cybersecurity space, there has been, I think, many initiatives over the last several years now on the part of jurisdictions to kind of develop baseline cybersecurity requirements. And I think certainly this could present one way in which a jurisdiction may consider erecting cybersecurity regulation. But at the same time, I do think that there are areas that could do with some additional improvement with regard to clarity, with regard to some of the things that they're asking right now. For example, one of the articles requires that vulnerabilities are disclosed, and there's a major concern among manufacturers and providers that these vulnerabilities would not have the ability to be patched before notifying. And so there's some concern about the way in which that might present additional cybersecurity risk if you were to be kind of reporting on unpatched vulnerabilities. So there are some areas that I think we're hoping to see kind of improved as we move forward with the trilogue negotiations, so as to balance protection of cybersecurity with also ensuring that you're not introducing new cybersecurity risk into the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. You did mention that the EU Cyber Resilience Act is very, very broad. It covers basically everything with software in it. Does the US regulation also cover essentially everything? And I'm particularly interested in products that have like hardware that has a software component. I'm asking this because we recently saw a bill going through or in the process of going through, specifically targeting medical devices, which are devices that have software. And the US legislator is now worried that such devices might be open to vulnerabilities, to exploits, to not being patched either at all or frequently enough or at the right speed. And medical devices are just an example because there are multiple pieces of hardware that has software components in them, and the companies are not always as diligent as they should be in updating that software. Is all that, all this software, which is not strictly software, also covered in regulations both in the US and in the EU?
So like we mentioned, in the EU, it is a fairly broad remit. So it would appear that a product with the digital element could theoretically include a product that contains software and hardware, right? Because that makes up many products in this day and age. In the US, as I understand it, it is specifically applying to software, the OMB memo, the definition of critical software, which really focuses not on kind of the hardware component, but on the software component. So if you are selling that software to the government, that is then your kind of cue to provide the self-attestation form. But as of right now, like you mentioned, there are some kind of specific bills that have been introduced or sector regulators that are thinking through these issues, but there isn't a comprehensive approach to kind of encapsulating hardware with software as well.
Okay. Definitely leaves room for improvement by the regulator and the legislator. One of the most often commented on piece of software when it comes to software in general and software supply chain in particular is open source components. Most software today is comprised of various pieces of open source, recompiled, reconnected, reconfigured, and nicely packed with various other pieces. Now, open source by its very nature does not usually follow under almost any kind of regulation because there's nobody funding it. There's nobody who's responsible, as it were, other than the people who are writing it. Could be as many or as few as one person who's maintaining a critical open source package. So the question is open source, how is open source considered in the US versus the EU when it comes to either complying with that regulation or how to deal with it being included in your software when there's no way for you to attest or check if it does indeed comply.
Yeah, so you're right. Open source, I think, presents an interesting compliance challenge. With regard to the US, I mean, NIST was directed to include practices in its SSDF relating to the extent practicable, as it quotes in the executive order, the integrity and provenance of open source used within any portion of a product. But again, as we're translating that into the self-attestation form, the memos actually state that it does not apply to no cost, publicly available proprietary software, so out of scope for collection. And then the second memo, M2316, restates that software that is freely and directly obtained by federal agencies is outside the scope, and that applies to no cost, publicly available proprietary software. So it would seem to me from reading that open source is out of scope of the self-attestation form for the reasons that you've stated. That being said, in the EU, they also consider open source and some of the kind of recital non-binding language. It says that essentially in order to avoid hampering innovation, free and open source software that's developed or supplied outside of the course of what they say is commercial activity should not be covered by the regulation. So they exempt it if it's not provided in the course of commercial activity. It does obligate manufacturers to identify, or if they identify a vulnerability in a component, including in an open source component, which is integrated into their product, to report the vulnerability to the person or the entity that is in possession or maintaining that component. But other than that, open source is theoretically excluded from the scope of the regulation as well. And so I think, regarding commercial activity, I think there's been some question around what exactly that means. And so, some of the conversations we've had have been to ask them to more clearly define kind of what they mean by commercial activity. So to provide more certainty for businesses that are doing business there to understand kind of at what point does this constitute commercial activity and what exactly does that look like?
Yeah, especially because there are some companies whose main business model is to take an open source product and then commercialize it. The open source still exists, people can still use it freely, but there's a different business model for charging for particular services or changes to that open source model or giving additional services to the open source part. Because it still exists as open source, it's kind of ambiguous whether or not it's covered or not, and claims could be made probably in court or to an auditor either way. So it's still, there's still a lot that still needs to be discussed when it comes to open source. The US has recently initiated a new position, which is the Office of the National Cyber Director. What exactly is the National Cyber Director? What is their job, and how are they meant to achieve it?
Yeah, so this is a position that was created in Congress in 2021, and it is a part of the White House. This was established, I think, largely because, previously in the US, there were different positions in different agencies throughout the government that were responsible for cybersecurity related functions. The National Cyber Director is intended to kind of coordinate all of those functions and act as kind of the leading voice in cybersecurity issues. So really acting in a way that helps to coordinate many of the different agencies across cybersecurity issues and present kind of a unified perspective on cybersecurity. So really kind of providing an advisory role across the government on cybersecurity issues. And so with that, it's a political position. So folks are appointed by the administration to become that position, and then they are confirmed via a process here in the United States to actually hold that position. And so that has been certainly we have seen one cyber director already. We now have an acting cyber director. And so, we'll see whether we have a confirmation prior to the next election. But
we'll definitely see. One of the last few questions that I wanted to ask about is concerning a planned framework that is called Safe Harbor. Now, Safe Harbor currently exists in the U.S. as a state by state, or there are several states that have created a Safe Harbor plan. Essentially, the idea is that if you can prove that you followed all the best practices, all the good steps that you were supposed to, you are protected from litigation. That they can't charge you with, breach of trust or failure to comply with some sort of regulation or to save or protect your data if you can prove that you did everything you should have done and that you could have done to protect it. Now, earlier this year in March, there was a paper called the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was published. If I recall, it was published by the White House. And in it, I found it very interesting that it was noted that there's a plan, or at least an idea, to make Safe Harbor a framework that covers the entire United States. So as a sort of carrot, if you are able to indeed prove, either by the self-attestation form or by some other way, that you do have all the required proof, attestations, evidence, papers, logs, whatever is required to prove that you did everything you should have done, all the best practices, you followed SSDF, you're even more stringent than that, and you follow the SALSA framework, you did everything you should have done, you should be protected from litigation. And since litigation is a very big deal in the US, I was wondering if you see where this planned framework is going to go. Is it something that we have a chance of seeing within this quarter, the following year? Is it ever going to happen? What is going to be the scope of such a framework if it does come to fruition?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, this concept of shifting liability for insecure software or products appeared in the 2023 National Cyber Strategy. I think it's Strategic Objective 3.3. And this was a concept that was introduced by the administration, theoretically exploring how to create a framework that would potentially address issues related to software liability. And as a part of that, the strategy does introduce this concept of safe harbor, which, as you explained, would protect companies from litigation if they could demonstrate that they do, in fact, do all of the things related to secure software development. With regard to kind of where we see it going, I think as we've understood it from the administration, it's in the very early days. And so in the implementation plan that was released for the National Cyber Strategy in July this year, there is kind of different pillars that are laid out. And in the 3.3 pillar, it discusses that initially the Office of the National Cyber Director will hold what they're calling a legal symposium with different stakeholders to explore this concept of a software liability framework, examine kind of existing legal and regulatory frameworks, including product liability here in the United States, to see kind of where it applies, where there might be challenges or gaps in the legal regime, and then from there determine kind of what the appropriate approach to creating or amending liability regimes are here in the United States. Again, as a part of that, they discuss this concept of creating the safe harbor framework, but that would really require Congress to act as well. And so I think given we're in early days, I don't think that we'll be moving kind of at rapid fire pace to this framework. I think first and foremost, we'll have to see when the legal symposium is held, and then from there, kind of see where we're at in terms of the election cycle and all of that to kind of see how quickly we think this will actually move forward. But like I said, I think we're kind of in the early phases of that here in the US.
Okay. Because we're constantly comparing US to EU, does the EU require the same sort of evidence package, as it were, to prove that people are following the requirements, or is there a different way for companies to show compliance? And if whether or not they do or do not, is a framework like Safe Harbor is going to be applied both in the EU and probably eventually worldwide? Because if companies cannot be guaranteed that if they do everything they should, they could at least expect to be exempt from prosecution, why should they even bother? Because everybody knows you're going to get hacked eventually, no matter what you do. The hackers, the bad guys, keep advancing their tools. So if there's no benefit either, at least in the terms of, there are tons of benefits, don't get me wrong, but if there's no way to at least protect you from litigation, you wouldn't work as hard. Having that carrot of protection from litigation is really, really good, which is why I'm asking is what's the EU equivalent, if there is one?
Yeah, so as a part of the CRA, there is a requirement that a provider of a product with digital elements provides certain documentation to demonstrate that they have similarly kind of met the essential baseline requirements, that they are appropriately taking the steps to secure their product or software. And so that could include, again, a software bill of materials. They talk about providing information about their vulnerability handling process, and kind of reporting vulnerabilities and a description of the technical solutions that they're choosing to provide kind of secure software updates. And so, like I said, the proposal is tiered based on different risk levels. And so at a lower risk level, you may only have to kind of provide evidence if you were asked that you've done these things. But there is a conformity assessment piece of this as well, where if you are providing some of these products that are classified as highly critical products, then you will have to undergo actually a third-party conformity assessment to demonstrate that you are in fact in conformance with the regime. And so kind of depending on where you're at, you have either the third-party conformance attestation that you are, doing everything that you should be doing in accordance with the law, or kind of the self-attestation component of it. I haven't seen the words kind of safe harbor in particular in the actual text that's being proposed, but Europe has a different liability regime than the US, and I'm slightly less familiar with the exact ins and outs of it, so I wouldn't want to misstate anything on this webinar. So I would want to do a little bit more due diligence. And I am also not a lawyer, so do not ask me for legal advice about, don't take anything I'm saying as legal advice, but certainly
Sure.
from my read of
this is meant as an introductory
yes.
to cover the basics. None of us are lawyers. We're
yes.
just here to familiarize our audience with the existing and shaping regulation in the US versus the EU. Because we're almost out of time, I would like to touch on one other aspect, and I think it's pretty much global. CISA has recently released a very, very interesting paper, which is called Security by Design and Security by Default. Its main essence is about shifting the mindset globally, not particularly in the US or the EU. There were a lot of different global agencies which have joined CISA in releasing this paper, showing that it's not a US paper, it's essentially a global piece, thought leadership piece, as it were. And the idea is that currently a lot of very, very large companies are doing everything they can, and they have the funds to do it, to shift responsibility in regards to cybersecurity to either smaller companies, the users themselves, other third parties. It's not my fault, it's not my responsibility, somebody else should take the blame. When I read it, it brought to mind a similar structure when it comes to, for example, recycling. A lot of the pollution is being done by very, very large companies, and yet when we think about clearing the environment or recycling, we don't think about what the big companies are doing, we think about what each of us are doing. And yet, all the citizens in the world are doing in terms of recycling is a drop in the bucket when considered against the pollution done by the biggest companies involved. Likewise, the idea is that when you produced software, when you produce or about to produce software, if you design it in advance to be secure by design and by default, so you shouldn't have to tweak anything for it to be secure. It's secure out of the box. You can tweak something to make it less secure, but out of the box, it's supposed to be secure, is the main issue here. And the idea is, or the question, I should say, do you think such a mindset shift is likely, both in the US, the EU, or elsewhere? Because it seems like it's human nature to try to shift responsibility and avoid blame. And unless software producers take the responsibility and the blame when it's due, nothing is going to change.
I mean, I do think that we're already seeing a bit of a mindset shift. Certainly, this administration, as you note here in the US, has placed a premium on, as they call it, shifting responsibility. But I mean, I do think it's important to note that there are many companies that are taking steps to provide the appropriate assurance and make sure that what they are developing is secure. But I think, the fact that, as you mentioned, this is a global document, countries around the world signed on to it, I do think that's indicative of this kind of global mindset shift writ large, where folks are starting to really kind of sign on to this concept of secure by design and by default. And so, many of the practices that are contained within the document are things that companies are already doing. I think some probably are in a slightly more mature place than I can only speak for the companies that I work with, many of whom are already kind of doing many of these practices. But certainly, I think the idea is that there will be a baseline across industry that products are designed from the outset with security in mind. And so I do think that we'll see, over the coming years, I think additional focus put on this point. And that's why we're seeing things like the Cybersecurity Resilience Act in the European Union coming to the fore. That's why you're seeing kind of these concepts being introduced in things like the National Cybersecurity Strategy here in the United States, because I do think that there is a global mindset shift that is starting to occur.
Great. We're almost out of time. So before I go, I would like to offer like a brief TLDR for people who don't have the patience to listen to this whole thing. In the US, we have several pieces of regulations. We could say that it culminates in the OMB, in the latest OMB memo, which is M2316. There's a self-attestation form that companies who want to sell to the federal government have to sign, attesting, as it were, that they are safe, that they follow all the requirements. How they are meant to prove it is still up in the air. The self-attestation form has not yet been confirmed, but we're guessing, I guess is the right word, that it's going to be confirmed within the next quarter before 2024 starts. Once that form is completed, critical infrastructure has 3 months to comply. Everybody else has 6 months. And when I say everybody else, I mean, again, companies who want to sell to the federal government. That's in the US. In the EU, we have the Cyber Resilience Act, which is much more broad, covers everybody, not just people who want to sell to the government. And the requirements, again, are very broad, specifically designed for every piece of software, even software that is part of something else. And the stick, as it were, is fines. If I remember correctly, you said up to 15 million euro or 2.5% of the global, earnings, whichever is higher in the following year. That is like the cliff notes. I would like to say that preparing for this webinar, both me and Courtney became aware that a lot of what we're talking about is still up in the air. There's still a lot of ambiguities and uncertainties. There's not a lot that we can say for certain that this is how it is. This is how it's going to be. This is the exact requirement. This is the exact paper or log that you need to produce. Because of that, because we didn't want to leave you with the feeling of, so what are they talking about if nothing is, settled yet? Because of that, we came up with the idea of repeating this webinar in more or less the same form in 6 months' time, which would make it February of 2024. We're really hoping that by that time, more of those requirements are going to be settled, and we can see what or which of our predictions have come true, if stuff has really gone forward the way we thought it would, the way we predict, or if you have the awesome opportunity to point at the screen and at us and laugh, haha, you were wrong. So yeah, there's not much more to say because everything is kind of in limbo right now. So Courtney, do you have any closing words?
No, I mean, I just think there's certainly a lot going on. There's a really big emphasis here in the US and in the EU and internationally on many of the concepts that we discussed today, but particularly on enhancing software supply chain security. So I think we will continue to see agencies and the government here prioritizing that, here being in the US. Certainly, we're a global association, so we also are seeing things unfold in other jurisdictions. And so we're keeping our eyes peeled to see kind of how things settle in the European Union. So we'll look forward to catching up again in the next couple of months as we see things progress.
I would like to say that even though we pointed out that we're not lawyers, we do read a lot. So at least on my part, if you guys who are watching this or listening have any questions regarding anything that we discussed today, or can't find a particular piece of or form or law or memo, you would like, okay, so you said that memo. Can you say which page, which paragraph? I'm going to attach my email when this webinar is published on YouTube, so you can find it there. You can look me up. It's Black Budo is pretty unique name. I should be easy to find, and you can write to me. And if I am able to, I will help you find exactly which piece of legislation or rule we were discussing and why we interpreted that way. Having said that, I would like to thank Courtney from the bottom of my heart for taking the time and having the expertise required to answer all these complicated questions when regarding to these unfolding regulations. And I'm looking forward to catching up with you in 6 months' time. Thank you very much, and thank you, all of you, for taking the time to listen. Have a great day.